They say the truth always comes out. But Daniel never imagined it would flash on a giant screen at his in-laws' party. For years, his wife Sophia drained their savings to bankroll a fake rich lifestyle, gifts, trips, all to outshine her perfect sister. At the reunion, she planned to showcase their account balance as proof of success. Instead, the screen showed zero, and everyone was about to discover who really emptied it. This is the story of Daniel and Sophia, a marriage on paper, but a silent war over money and image. Sophia wasn't just generous, she was addicted to the illusion of wealth, terrified of being outshone by her high-earning sister. Every skipped mortgage payment, every secret credit card, was a brick in the facade. Daniel watched the accounts drain month after month, but instead of a confrontation, he made a quiet, irreversible move. What Sophia saw as a joint account she could empty was actually a decoy. The real savings had disappeared long before that screen ever lit up. The question is, where did it go? To understand why that screen showed zero, you have to understand Sophia's life before Daniel, before the marriage, before the quiet war of bank statements and credit card bills. Sophia grew up in the shadow of her sister, Elena, the one who got the high-paying job, the luxury condo, the husband who drove a European car. Every family gathering was a competition Sophia knew she was losing. While Elena gave cashmere throws and talked about their upcoming European river cruise, Sophia was clipping coupons and calculating how to afford a modest holiday dinner. The sting of being the other daughter never left her. So when Sophia married Daniel, a steady, hard-working mid-level manager at a logistics firm, she saw a chance to finally rewrite her story. Not by out-earning Elena, but by outspending her. Daniel had worked for 12 years to build a solid nest egg, a joint savings account intended for retirement, their children's college, a rainy day. In the beginning, Sophia's first few purchases were small, a designer handbag for her mother, a weekend trip to a resort she could post about. She told Daniel it was just a little treat. He believed her. But little treats have a way of turning into a full-blown obsession. By the third year of their marriage, Sophia was no longer making occasional purchases, she was funding an entire alternate reality. Every birthday became an excuse for a lavish trip. Every holiday required gifts that cost more than their mortgage payment. She booked first-class flights, rented luxury cars, and hosted dinners at five-star restaurants, all while presenting it as our success to a family that watched in awe. Daniel would see the charges later, his stomach tight. But whenever he brought it up, Sophia had a weapon she'd perfected. Shame. "You want me to look like a failure in front of my own parents?" she'd say, or Alina never has to answer to anyone about how she spends. The conversation would end with her crying and him feeling like the villain. Meanwhile, the joint account that started with nearly $240,000 began to bleed. Slowly at first, then faster. Daniel started keeping a private log. A sudden $4,000 withdrawal for a family cruise. A $2,000 jewelry purchase for her niece's wedding, when she wasn't even in the bridal party. The pattern was undeniable. Sophia was not just spending for joy, she was curating an Instagram-worthy life at the expense of their actual future. One night, after she had charged a $12,000 trip to a private island for her parents and sister's family, using a credit card she'd secretly opened in her name but linked to the joint account for payments, Daniel confronted her with bank statements in hand. "Sophia, we have nothing left for the kids' education," he said. She looked at the papers, and instead of acknowledging the disaster, she accused him of trying to control her. "You're just like everyone else," she said. "You want me to stay small." That was the moment Daniel realized that talking would never stop her. He needed to protect what remained, not by fighting her openly, but by moving the money to a place she could never touch. Daniel consulted a financial advisor, then a trust attorney. He discovered he could create an irrevocable educational trust for their children and future grandchildren. Irrevocable meant even he couldn't take the money back for himself, it was locked for the beneficiary's schooling, entirely out of reach of creditors, lawsuits, or a spouse with a spending compulsion. Over the course of 6 weeks, he liquidated the remaining savings, just under $90,000, and transferred every cent into the trust. He kept a separate joint account open at the same bank, one that Sophia could still see online, but one that he deliberately funded with a minimal balance. It was a decoy, a mirror that reflected whatever she wanted to believe. Sophia never noticed. Whenever she logged into the banking app, she'd see a balance that looked fine. Daniel had set up a fake aggregated view that merged the empty joint account with a non-transferable placeholder. A trick that worked because she never actually tried to make a large withdrawal. And then, in the months that followed, she kept spending on credit, and the minimum payments slowly drew the decoy account down to zero. By the time Sophia began planning the family reunion that would change everything, the decoy was dry. Sophia's idea was grand. Rent a private event hall, hire a live band, have a catered dinner, and display a massive screen showing a slideshow of their success. She wanted to end the night by projecting their bank account balance, a big, fat number that would prove, once and for all, that she was no longer in Alina's shadow. She told Daniel she'd pay for it with the rest of the savings. After all, they'd apparently accumulated again. Daniel nodded, said nothing, and quietly booked a ticket for their son to come home from college to witness the event. When the day arrived, the hall was filled with cousins, aunts, uncles, Alina, and her perfect family. Sophia looked radiant in a dress that cost more than the first car Daniel ever owned. She hugged Elena with a tight smile that said, "Watch me." Then she stepped to the podium, pulled out her phone, and cast the screen to the giant display. "And now," she said, voice trembling with excitement, "let's look at what hard work built." She tapped to log in. The audience watched the app load. The screen flickered, and the number that appeared was not a figure that would earn applause. It was 0. The room went silent, but before anyone could react, before Sophia could stammer an excuse, Daniel quietly stood up at the back of the hall. He hadn't spoken to her about the trust. He hadn't warned her about the decoy. Now, he was about to explain to everyone exactly where the money had gone, and what that 0 really meant. But what Daniel didn't know was that Sophia had invited someone else that night, someone who had been digging into Daniel's own financial past, and that person was about to turn a moment of humiliation into something far more explosive. The silence in the hall lasted maybe 3 seconds before Sophia's face went pale and she started scrambling for the power button, her finger jabbing at the phone as if that would somehow change the number. But the screen refused to update. 0 remained, stark, against the custom background she designed with golden letters reading our legacy. Then Daniel rose from his chair at the back. He didn't advance toward the podium. He simply stood where everyone could see him, calm, his hands at his sides, and opened his mouth to speak. He never got the chance. From the third row, a man none of the family recognized stood up, dressed in an immaculate gray suit, holding a tablet. He stepped into the aisle, tapped the screen once, and suddenly the projection behind Sophia flickered again. This time, not the bank app, but a series of scanned documents, bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, and what looked like a legal trust instrument with a state seal. "I think everyone here deserves the full picture," the man said, his voice carrying the practiced flatness of someone who'd presented evidence in courtrooms. Sophia spun around, momentarily distracted from the zero. Her eyes narrowed, but not in confusion. There was a glint of recognition. The man was Marcus Corbin, a forensic accountant she'd hired 2 months ago after Daniel had casually mentioned that savings weren't what they seemed. She'd paid him to dig, to find where her husband had hidden the real money, certain that the decoy account she'd bled dry for years was only a fraction of a larger hoard. She had invited Marcus tonight to show Daniel that she could play detective too. Marcus didn't pause for introductions. He swiped, and the new documents expanded. The account Sophia just showed you was closed to withdrawals 3 months ago because the funds had been systematically transferred out over a 6-week period. The receiving entity, he said, highlighting a trust name, is the Hawthorne Education Trust, a vehicle established by Daniel alone, with no spousal consent, under the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act. Sophia's mother, seated in the front row with her husband, let out a thin gasp. Daniel's face didn't change, but the slightest tightening around his jaw told everyone watching that Marcus wasn't wrong. The accountant swiped again. "What else can you tell us, Marcus?" Sophia asked, her voice now trembling with something closer to triumph than humiliation. Marcus projected a page of monthly transfers dating back years. He pointed at a column labeled Income Discrepancy. Daniel reported a net salary of $6,300 per month to the household budget. Yet payroll records from his employer show his actual take-home was $8,900. The difference, $2,600 every month, was routed into a separate account at First Mercantile Bank, an account Sophia never knew about. Over 8 years, that hidden salary account accumulated just over $240,000. The room erupted in murmurs. Cousins turned to aunts. Elena, seated at the head table with her immaculate husband, set down her wineglass with a sharp clink. Now Daniel spoke, but he didn't raise his voice. "I set up the trust to protect our children's education, your children's education, because you were spending us into a hole. The hidden salary? That's the only reason we still have a roof over our heads. It was never a secret to hurt you. It was a shield to stop you from turning gifts into bankruptcy." Sophia rounded on him, stabbing a finger at the screen. "You hid money from your wife. You made me look like a fool in front of my entire family while you played martyr in your flannel shirts and your I'm just a simple man act. You're no different from the criminals you used to prosecute." That line landed like a slap, and Daniel's eyes narrowed. But before he could respond, Marcus flipped to yet another document, and the tempo of the room shifted. "Daniel is not exactly a stranger to hiding money," Marcus said, lowering the tablet for a moment to let the projection fill the entire wall. In 1999, under the name Daniel Hart, his mother's maiden name, he was charged with embezzlement at a small brokerage in Ohio. The charge was reduced to falsifying business records, a misdemeanor, after he repaid $12,000. The case was sealed, but financial records don't forget. Sophia's father, a stoic man who rarely spoke, placed both hands on the table and pushed himself upright. "You brought a thief into our family?" he said, not to Sophia but to the ceiling, as if appealing to a higher authority. Daniel's son, 19-year-old Leo, who had been sitting quietly near the back, rose and moved toward his father. "Dad?" The word hung in the air like a balloon with too much helium. Daniel met his son's eyes but didn't flinch. "That was 24 years ago, before you were born. I was 19. Stupid, and I made a mistake. I paid every cent back, and that mistake is exactly why I built every wall you now see. It's why I'll never apologize for protecting what I built clean." Sophia's mother scowled. "Protecting? You've been fleecing her." Alina's husband, a corporate attorney named Richard, stood and buttoned his jacket. "This is sounding like marital fraud, Daniel. I'd be happy to represent my sister-in-law pro bono." The room was now a cacophony of accusations, but Marcus wasn't finished. He swiped to the final page of the trust instrument, and the noise subsided as the crowd read the highlighted line, "Co-trustee, Elena Vasquez." For a beat, nobody breathed. Elena Vasquez, Sophia's perfect sister, the one with the European car and the cashmere gifts. The woman Sophia had spent a decade trying to impress. Elena's name was on the legal document right below Daniel's. Sophia turned toward her sister so fast that her diamond earrings caught the light. "Is that real?" she whispered. Elena had gone pale, but her expression was not one of guilt. It was the controlled composure of someone who had been preparing for this exact moment. "Sophia, I can explain." That was all she needed to say. The rest of the family erupted. Maria, the matriarch, pointed a trembling finger at Elena. "You helped him hide money from your own sister?" Uncle Jorge stood up, his chair scraping. "Explain?" "You betrayed the family for that." He gestured at Daniel, searching for the right word, stranger. Daniel moved through the chaos, stepping up onto the low stage where Sophia still stood frozen. He didn't look at her. He faced Elena. "Tell them why." Elena's throat worked, but before she could speak, Marcus raised a hand. "Actually, that's not the most interesting part." He tapped his tablet once more, and a second page of the trust document appeared, a rider that had been added 6 months after the original filing. The rider named a contingent beneficiary, someone who would receive all assets if the primary beneficiaries, Daniel's children, were deemed incapacitated or if the marriage dissolved under specific conditions. That beneficiary was not a blood relative. It was St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. Sophia blinked, her fury momentarily displaced by confusion. "A charity?" Daniel nodded slowly. "The trust is irrevocable and includes a charitable remainder clause. If you ever tried to claw back the money in a divorce, or if I were to become incapacitated and you attempted to control the funds, the entire principal and accumulated earnings would transfer immediately to St. Jude's. The kids would still get their education through a scholarship fund administered by the hospital, but you would never touch a penny." He let that sink in, then turned to Elena. "And Elena didn't help me hide anything. She helped me build a legal structure that would survive any attempt to break it, because she was the only person in your family who truly understood what you were doing to our finances." Now the atmosphere twisted again. Elena stepped forward, her husband Richard suddenly looking less like an allied lawyer and more like a man who realized his own household was about to be dragged into the mud. "Sophia," Elena said, her voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it, "I watched you take out credit cards in Mom's name. I saw the statements for the resort you booked that you told us Daniel paid for. You've been draining him for years, and you tried to use me as a measuring stick. I didn't want your kids to lose their future because you couldn't stop competing with a life I never asked you to compete with." Sophia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Richard grabbed Elena's arm. "You knew about all of this and you didn't tell me?" Elena pulled her arm free. "Because you would have used it to get even more involved in their finances, Richard. You've been sniffing around Daniel's accounts for 2 years, hoping to manage his portfolio for a fee. I didn't want you to become another person exploiting my sister's mess." This was new information to the family. And now, Richard was the one looking cornered. Marcus, sensing that his client was losing the narrative, cleared his throat and projected one final slide. "There's a legal issue here that I was hired to uncover, and it has nothing to do with family drama. The trust's initial funding, the $90,000 Daniel transferred, came from a joint account. Under community property law, Sophia has a 50% claim to those funds. The transfer without spousal consent could constitute dissipation of marital assets, which would void the trust's protected status and require restitution. He looked at Daniel with the cold confidence of a man who believed he'd just checkmated an opponent. Daniel, however, smiled. It was a tired smile, but genuine. "You're right about the law, Marcus, but you missed one detail." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope, not cream-colored, but simple white, with something bulky inside. The $90,000 didn't come from the joint account. It came from the hidden salary account I mentioned, which was funded solely by my post-marital earnings that I kept separate for precisely this legal purpose. I paid taxes on it, I can trace every deposit back to my payroll, and I have a letter from a family court judge who reviewed the structure last year and confirmed it does not violate any spousal support obligation, because the joint account expenditures, Sophia's spending, have far exceeded any contribution she could claim. He handed the envelope to Marcus, who opened it with thin fingers. Inside was a notarized legal opinion and a USB drive. The hall had gone from spectacle to silent courtroom. Sophia's father sank back into his seat. Richard stared at Elena, who wouldn't meet his eyes. And Sophia, standing behind the podium that was supposed to display her triumph, looked at the screen, at the zero, at the documents and the trust and her sister's name, and for the first time that night, she looked at Daniel not with anger, but with something raw and unguarded. A question she didn't dare ask aloud. But just as the tension seemed ready to break, a new sound cut through the hall, a door at the far end opening, and a voice that none of them expected. "Daniel, you should have told me you were going to do this." It was the family's eldest, the matriarch, Abuela Rosa, who had been silent the entire evening, and now she was walking toward the stage with a cane. And attached to her other hand was a small boy, about 8 years old, who looked exactly like Daniel. The boy called out, "Papa?" The entire room, including Elena, turned to stone, because nobody, not Sophia, not the accountant, not the family, had ever seen that child before. And for the first time all night, Daniel's composure shattered. The child pulled away from Abuela Rosa and ran across the floor, his small sneakers squeaking on the polished wood, until he collided with Daniel's legs. Daniel dropped to one knee, his face a battlefield of panic, and something deeper, love, fierce and unguarded. He wrapped his arms around the boy, and for a long moment, the only sound in the hall was a soft, shuddering breath from a man who had finally run out of places to hide. Abuela Rosa stopped a few feet from the stage, leaning on her cane. Her old eyes swept the room, taking in the stunned faces of her children, grandchildren, and in-laws. "This is Mateo," she said, her voice thick with 86 years of authority. "He is my great-grandson, and Daniel has been his father since the day he was born." Sophia, still standing behind the podium, looked from the boy to Daniel and back again, her mind visibly trying to assemble a puzzle with pieces she had never seen before. Whose child is that?" she finally managed, her voice a whisper that carried through the silent hall like a scream. Daniel looked up at his wife, his eyes wet. "He's my son. He's 9 years old. His mother died last year in a car accident, and Abuela Rosa has been caring for him until we could figure out how to tell you." The word we hit the room with the force of a second shockwave. A collective murmur rippled through the family. Who was we? Elena, standing frozen by the head table, slowly covered her mouth with her hand. Her husband Richard stared at her, his jaw tight. "You knew," he said, barely a question. Elena didn't answer, but her silence was its own confession. Abuela Rosa raised a hand, quieting the murmurs. "I knew. Elena knew. And now you all will know, because the truth has been buried under too many lies already. She turned to Marcus, who was still holding his tablet, his expression shifting from professional detachment to acute interest. Young man, you are looking for the money? Then point your projector at what I am about to say. Marcus, ever the showman, tapped his screen and the empty projection wall lit up. Ready, Sophia found her voice again, now shaking with a different kind of fury. You've been hiding an entire child from me? For years? While I was spending to keep this family together, you were sneaking off to another family? Daniel rose, his hand still on Mateo's shoulder. There's no other family. Sophia, there's a boy who lost his mother, who is my blood, and who deserved to be safe. I hid him because I knew you would see him as a threat to your image, just like you saw my salary, our retirement, and every single thing I built for our children. Sophia's father suddenly stood up again, his face red. You bring a bastard child to a family reunion? And my wife's mother helped you? Abuela Rosa silenced him with a single look. He is no bastard. He is my great-grandson. And his mother was as innocent as any of you. Sit down, Miguel. The old man sat, but the tension was a live wire. Marcus, seizing the opportunity, swiped to a new scan. This adds an important dimension. The trust document names the children of Daniel as primary beneficiaries, without specifying names. That means Mateo, if legally recognized as Daniel's child, is entitled to an equal share of the education trust. So the $90,000 was not just for Sophia's children, it was for all of Daniel's offspring, including a child Sophia didn't know existed. That changes the nature of the concealment and possibly the fraud. Daniel pulled the letter from the judge back from Marcus. The trust was reviewed by a judge who knew about Mateo. It's part of the sealed family court file. Sophia never saw it, because she never looked. I didn't need her spousal consent because the trust was funded entirely from separate property. The hidden salary, which the court already ruled is non-marital because it was earned before the marriage's financial misconduct and because Sophia consented to the payroll structure when we first married. He looked directly at Sophia. You signed the prenuptial agreement that defined my base salary as $6,300 for household expenses, and anything beyond that was mine to invest as I saw fit. You didn't read it, but you signed it. A murmur of realization moved through the younger relatives. Sophia staggered back a step, knocking the podium. I never signed anything like that. Elena, her voice trembling, finally spoke. You did, Sophia. I was there. Mom was there. You wanted the wedding so badly, you signed without reading. Daniel made it very clear. Maria, the matriarch, now sat with her hands over her face, shoulders shaking. Uncle Jorge looked like he wanted to punch someone. Richard, always the lawyer, stepped forward, his composure cracking. Even with a prenup, concealing a child for over a decade constitutes a fraud on the marital relationship. The court could set aside that agreement. Daniel met his gaze. The child was born 1 year before we married. I didn't conceal him, I just never disclosed him. That's not legal fraud. And given the spending Sophia has done, hundreds of thousands of dollars in undisclosed credit cards and secret accounts, any court will be more interested in her financial infidelity than in my private family history. Your own forensic accountant can testify to that. Can't you, Marcus? Marcus paused, genuinely caught. His client had hired him to find Daniel's hidden assets, not to uncover her own trail of deceit. I haven't examined her records in depth, he admitted. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Then maybe you should. Because the account Sophia showed tonight as zero, that wasn't the one she's been draining. That's the decoy I set up after I moved the savings. But the real joint account, the one she spent dry over 5 years, still has a paper trail of her withdrawals. I have every statement, and it adds up to more than $340,000, way more than my hidden salary ever earned. The family, now a jury of angry aunts and uncles, turned their heads toward Sophia. She stood like a deer in headlights, her elaborate plan crumbling. "That's not, you can't prove." Her voice trailed off. Alina walked over to Daniel and took the envelope of documents from his hand, pulling out a thick sheaf of bank printouts, no fancy projections, just paper. She held them up. "I helped him gather these, Sophia. I watched you spend more last year on a single vacation than Mom and Dad spent to raise us. You used our parents' credit card to book part of it. That's elder fraud. I wanted to protect you, but you brought that accountant here to burn Daniel down. So now the truth burns you." Marcus, sensing imminent damage to his professional reputation, tried to pivot. If those documents are authentic, then Sophia's spending could be considered dissipation, which would offset any claim she has against Daniel's separate property. That actually strengthens Daniel's legal position. Richard slowly sat down, his earlier offer of representation evaporating. Sophia looked around the room, the faces of her family now mirrors of accusation. She spotted her sister Elena, and something snapped. "You always wanted to be the perfect one. You set this whole thing up with him, you and Abuela, to humiliate me." She lunged forward, but Leo, her own son, stepped into her path. "Mom, stop." His voice cracked. "You just found out Dad has another kid. You're really more angry about the money than about that?" The question hung like a bell tolling. Sophia blinked, and for the first time she looked at Mateo, the boy clinging to Daniel's side, dark eyes full of confusion. The fight drained from her in a single, long exhale. But Abuela Rosa wasn't finished. "There is one more thing." The old woman raised her cane and pointed it at Marcus. "You were hired by Sophia, yes, but who told you about the embezzlement charge from 24 years ago? Who gave you the sealed record?" Marcus froze. Sophia's eyes went wide. "I didn't. That wasn't in the file I gave you." Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came. Abuela Rosa's gaze moved to Richard, the lawyer husband, now ashen. "You told him. You opened that sealed record to give your sister-in-law a weapon, because you thought you'd get a cut of whatever settlement she won. You were her silent partner." Richard stood up fast enough to knock over his chair. "That's a lie." But Alina was already pulling out her phone, showing a series of text messages that she'd apparently kept for just this moment. "No, Richard, it's not. You asked me 6 months ago if Daniel had any criminal history, pretending it was a routine background check for a business partnership. I told you no, but you went digging anyway. You hired a private investigator and gave the findings to Sophia's accountant because you wanted a piece of the action. You're the reason all of this became public tonight." The room erupted. Richard's cornered denials mixed with Sophia's crumbling narrative. Daniel held Mateo close, whispering something in his ear. Then he turned to Elena. "Tell them the last part." Elena wiped her eyes, then faced her family. "The trust has a charitable remainder clause that goes to St. Jude's only if the marriage breaks down under certain specific conditions, namely, if Daniel ever transfers the assets back to himself, or if Sophia attempts a fraudulent divorce. Daniel never wanted that. He wanted the children to be safe, but he also wanted something else. He wanted you, Sophia, to understand that the money wasn't being hidden from you. It was being saved from you. And he wanted you to know tonight, in front of everyone, that he knew all along what you were doing, and he still chose to protect your children rather than punish you." That landed with the weight of an anvil. Sophia sank onto the edge of the stage, her expensive dress pooling around her like a deflated sail. The zero on the screen behind her was now immaterial. Everyone had forgotten it, replaced by a much larger, much more personal truth. Marcus discreetly folded his tablet and stepped back into the shadows, his services abruptly concluded. Richard stood alone, his career and reputation in tatters, and the family, torn between sympathy and outrage, looked to Abuela Rosa for guidance. The old woman thumped her cane once. "Now," she said, "Daniel will speak. He will tell all of you where the money actually is and why no one will ever be able to waste it again. And then you will decide what kind of family you want to be." She looked at Daniel, who nodded slowly. He released Mateo's hand, stood straight, and walked toward the podium where Sophia still sat slumped. He didn't reach for her. He reached for the microphone. But let me be absolutely clear about something. The real bomb hadn't gone off yet. Daniel had one final piece of evidence, something even Elena didn't know. And it was about to prove that not only had Sophia's spending been fraudulent, but that she had planned to frame him for a crime. And that piece of evidence was sitting inside the pocket of the man who just tried to vanish, Marcus, who was now being stopped at the door by a tall figure in a police uniform. The tall figure in the doorway wasn't a stranger to everyone. Officer Ramirez had grown up 2 streets over from Abuela Rosa, and his presence tonight was not a coincidence. He raised a hand, not to grab Marcus, but to present a folded warrant. "Marcus Corbin, you are being detained for questioning in connection with a conspiracy to fabricate financial evidence. Your devices, including that tablet, are now under a preservation order. Please step away from the exit." Marcus turned the color of week-old milk. He looked back at Sophia with the unmistakable expression of a man who realizes his client has just become his cellmate. Sophia's mouth opened, but no sound came out, just a dry, terrified rasp. Daniel walked to the center of the room, holding a small USB drive up between 2 fingers. "This," he said, "contains every message Sophia sent to Marcus over the past 8 weeks. It details a plan to create a fake offshore account in my name, backdated by 5 years, complete with forged bank documents. The plan was for Marcus to discover it tonight, accuse me of hiding millions, and pressure me into a divorce settlement that would hand Sophia control over everything. After that, Marcus would receive 30% of the assets he helped her seize." The room broke into a chorus of indignation, but Daniel overrode it. "I found out because Marcus isn't just an accountant, he was Richard's law school classmate. And Richard, while digging into my past, accidentally CC'd Daniel Hart instead of Daniel Vasquez on an email. I received the whole thread, including the part where Sophia wrote, and I quote, 'He'll never see it coming. He's too busy playing humble king in his garden.' Richard, who had been trying to edge toward the side exit, found his path blocked by Uncle Jorge's broad shoulders. 'You're not going anywhere, abogado,' Jorge rumbled. Elena, tears streaming, marched over to her husband. 'You helped her try to destroy Daniel, to frame him for something he didn't do? That's not just unethical, Richard. That's criminal.' Richard fumbled for words, but the familial courtroom had already convicted him. Officer Ramirez stepped forward, his voice calm but immovable. 'I'll need statements from all primary parties. Mr. Vasquez, you filed a preemptive affidavit and provided the email chain. That's why we're here tonight, to interrupt the public presentation of falsified documents. The district attorney will review charges for conspiracy, attempted fraud, and, if the originals match your claims, evidence tampering.' He turned to Marcus. 'You can wait in my vehicle.' 2 uniformed officers appeared in the doorway as if on cue. And Marcus, now entirely stripped of his polished arrogance, allowed himself to be led away, tablet confiscated. Sophia stood like a statue with a shattered pedestal. She turned to her family, her voice pathetically small. "I just wanted you to be proud of me." Her mother, Maria, finally lifted her head from her hands. "By lying? By trying to destroy the father of your children? This is not pride, hija. This is sickness." Abuela Rosa thumped her cane once, and the authority that had held the family together for 3 generations settled back over the hall. "Sophia, you will sit down, and you will listen. For the first time in your life, you will listen entirely." Daniel walked to the podium, but he didn't stand behind it. He stood beside it, where everyone could see him, and he waited until the silence was absolute. "The account Sophia showed you tonight is empty, because I emptied it 2 years ago. The money, just under $90,000, went into an irrevocable education trust for Leo, for our daughter Camila, and for Mateo. That trust cannot be touched by divorce lawyers, by creditors, or by anyone who thinks they can grab a piece of it. The trust also pays a small monthly stipend to Abuela Rosa, who gave up part of her own retirement to care for Mateo when his mother died. That wasn't a secret plot. It was a promise." He tapped the USB drive into a small reader connected to the projector, and a single document replaced the 0 on the screen. A signed, notarized statement from the family court judge, acknowledging the trust and noting that Sophia's financial misconduct had voided any community property claim she might have had over those particular assets. The court already reviewed everything: my hidden salary, my prenup, my trust. All of it was disclosed under seal 2 years ago. "I didn't hide money from the law. I hid it from you, Sophia, because every time you saw a balance, you saw permission to spend." Leo, still standing between his parents, stepped forward. He looked 10 years older than he had at the start of the evening. "Mom, the island trip last year? The one I told you I didn't even want to go on because I knew we couldn't afford it? You used Abuela's credit card for the deposit. I found the bill on her dresser. That's why I came home early from school. I was going to confront you. But Dad asked me to wait. He said you needed to show everyone who you really were first." Sophia's face crumbled. She reached for her son, but he didn't meet her halfway. "I'm not angry about the money," he said, quieter. "I'm angry you made me a prop in your lies." Alina crossed the floor slowly, and for a moment it looked like she might strike her sister. Instead, she placed a thick envelope on the podium, the same one Daniel had handed Marcus earlier. "These are the real bank records, Sophia. I've had them for a year. I didn't show them to you because I kept hoping you'd stop on your own. But you kept going, and when you hired Marcus, you forced my hand. So I helped Daniel build the trust. Not to hurt you, to save your children from your addiction." Richard, who had remained silent and cornered, finally cracked. "Alina, I did this for us. Do you know how much money we could have managed if Daniel had been forced to split assets?" Alina turned to him, and her voice was ice. "We're done, Richard. The house is in my name. The Cayman account you thought I didn't know about has been reported, and your firm will receive a formal complaint in the morning. You used my family as a personal payout machine. That ends tonight." Richard's face slackened into the hollow expression of a man who has just watched every pillar of his life collapse. Now Abuela Rosa rose again, and this time she beckoned Mateo to her side. The boy walked to her, still clinging to Daniel's jacket for a moment before letting go. "This child," she announced, "is the son of Daniel and a woman named Inez, who worked at Daniel's company years ago. When Inez became ill, Daniel tried to bring Mateo home, but Sophia refused to let him into the house, said it would embarrass her. So I took Mateo into my home, and Daniel visited every week, paid every medical bill, and never missed a single school event. That is the kind of man you tried to destroy tonight. Not a thief. Not a liar. A father. Sophia dropped to her knees on the stage, her dress pooling around her, and began to cry. Not the theatrical sobbing she had used for years, but a broken, hollow sound that echoed in the silent hall. Daniel walked to her, bent down, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm not pressing charges against you," he said, so quietly the microphone barely caught it. "But you're going to sign a separation agreement tonight that waives all claim to the trust, to the business property, and to my separate accounts. You'll get a fair monthly support payment, more than fair, on 2 conditions." She looked up, eyes raw. "What conditions?" "First, you will attend weekly financial counseling and therapy for the next 2 years. Second, you will tell our children, in your own words, that the life you tried to build was built on lies, and that they are never to carry your shame for you." She nodded, weeping, and Daniel helped her to her feet, not as a husband reclaiming a wife, but as a man closing a door with finality. The officer returned, taking brief statements from Alina and Daniel, noting Richard's involvement for the DA, and informing the family that they were free to go. The hired catering staff, who had witnessed the entire unraveling, quietly finished packing the untouched dessert trays and slipped out. The band, who had been waiting in the wings, packed their instruments with the relieved gratitude of people who were definitely getting paid regardless. Then the room emptied slowly. One by one, the extended family came forward, not to Sophia, but to Daniel, to Mateo, to Elena and Abuela Rosa. Hands were shaken, embraces given, apologies murmured. Uncle Jorge clapped Daniel on the shoulder. "You played a long game, hermano. I respect it." Maria kissed her grandson Mateo on the forehead and whispered something that made the boy smile for the first time all night. The final surprising detail came not from Daniel, but from Elena. She drew Sophia aside as the last guests lingered near the door. "You should know. The charitable remainder clause to St. Jude's? I suggested it. But I didn't do it to punish you. I did it because when I was 16, I had a daughter. She was born with a heart condition, and St. Jude's saved her life. She's 22 now, in med school, and you never knew she existed because I gave her up for adoption to keep the family's perfect image. So when I say I understand hiding things from this family to protect a child, believe me, I understand more than anyone. Daniel's trust ensures no kid ever gets sacrificed for our pride again." Sophia stared at her sister, and in that look, the entire fiction of their competition collapsed. Daniel gathered Mateo into his arms and walked out of the hall with Leo and Camila flanking him. The cool night air hit their faces, and the kids let out shaky breaths that turned into tired laughter. "Can we get waffles?" Mateo asked, his voice small but unburdened. Daniel looked at his 3 children, standing under the parking lot lights, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a decade: peace. "We can get all the waffles you want." They drove away in his modest sedan, the Tacoma-like practicality of the man, leaving behind the wreckage of a night that had exposed every crack in a family's foundation, and, in doing so, had made it possible to rebuild.